Major General Evelyn Reed's reputation preceded her, but not in a way that most people expected. It wasn't built on a foundation of theatrical displays or a booming voice. Instead, it was forged in the quiet fire of competence and an unnerving ability to see what others missed. She had a knack for taking a troubled unit, one riddled with complacency and rot, and surgically cutting out the cancer. Her methods were unconventional, her demeanor often cold, and her successes undeniable. Her next assignment was Fort Bracken, a sprawling, aging installation in the heart of rural Kansas. The post was a dumping ground for those who couldn't cut it elsewhere, a bureaucratic backwater where careers went to die. Reports from the Inspector General had piled up on her desk, each one a litany of infractions, security lapses, and a general malaise that festered from the top down. The current post commander, Colonel Davies, was a political appointee, more interested in his golf game than his troops. Reed, a woman who believed in a hands-on approach, decided to forego the usual fanfare of a general's arrival. No motorcade, no welcoming committee, no starched uniforms and polished boots. Instead, she rented a nondescript Ford sedan in the nearest town and drove the final 30 miles herself. She was dressed in civilian clothes, simple gray sweater, dark trousers, and a pair of worn leather boots. Her hair was pulled back into a severe bun, and her face, lined with the stress of 3 combat tours and a dozen difficult assignments, held a neutral, observant expression. She looked less like a 2-star general and more like a weary civilian on her way to a family reunion. This was by design. She wanted to see the first point of contact, the front door of Fort Bracken, without any pretense. The main gate came into view, a rusty iron arch flanked by 2 concrete guard shacks. The grass around the entrance was overgrown, and a discarded coffee cup lay on the asphalt. 2 young soldiers, both no older than 20, were on duty. One, a lanky private with a too-high haircut and an air of swagger, leaned against the shack, scrolling on his phone. The other, a corporal with a drooping cigarette in his mouth, was halfway out of the other shack, chatting with a truck driver. Neither noticed her until she was a dozen yards from the barrier. The Private First Class Miller, finally looked up, his brow furrowing in irritation. He held up a hand, a gesture of lazy dismissal. "Hold it right there, ma'am," he called out, his voice tinged with boredom. General Reed stopped the car and rolled down her window. The corporal, whose NAMA tag identified him as Corporal Vance, ambled over, his boots shuffling in the gravel. He took a long drag from his cigarette and exhaled a cloud of smoke directly toward her car. "What's your need?" Vance asked, his tone condescending. He looked her up and down, his eyes lingering on her hands, which gripped the steering wheel. He saw no wedding ring, no military ID hanging from a lanyard, just a tired-looking woman in a simple car. "I have orders to report," Reed said, her voice even and calm. Vance snorted, a laugh rumbling in his chest. "Orders? What kind of orders, ma'am? You a new contractor? We don't get many of those on a Saturday." He glanced at Miller, who snickered and went back to his phone. Reed felt the familiar knot of professional frustration tighten in her stomach. The lax attitude, the lack of situational awareness, the complete absence of military bearing, it was all here, just as the reports had said. They're my official orders, she repeated, her patience already wearing thin. I need to get to the commander's office. Vance's face hardened, a mask of self-importance replacing his earlier boredom. Look, lady, you gotta show me some ID. It's regulations, We can't just let anyone waltz onto the post. I am aware of the regulations, Reed said, her tone taking on a sharp edge. I am also aware that you are supposed to be conducting a proper security check, not talking on your cell phone and smoking on duty. Your attention to detail is lacking. The corporal's mouth dropped open slightly, his swagger deflating for a moment before reinflating with indignation. Whoa, now. Watch your tone, Q. You don't get to come here and tell us how to do our jobs. He leaned down, his face a few inches from her window. Now, show me your ID and your vehicle registration, or you're going to have a bad day. Reed decided to play the game. Turt. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a manila envelope. Inside were the orders, a formal directive from the Department of the Army, assigning her as the new commander of Fort Bracken. It was not her military ID, a strategic omission on her part. She held it out to him. Vance took the envelope with a theatrical sigh, his fingers fumbling with the seal. He pulled out the thick stack of papers, his eyes scanning the first page. He saw her name, Major General Evelyn Reed, and a long list of military acronyms and directive numbers. He blinked, a look of confusion on his face. What is this? He asked, holding the papers as if they were a foreign object. This ain't no ID, and who the heck is Evelyn Reed? He was so lost in his own arrogance that the 2 stars, the rank listed in bold type, completely escaped his notice. That would be me, she said, a small, humorless smile touching her lips. Miller, having been roused by the sound of Vance's increasingly agitated voice, finally came over. What's the holdup, Vance? Just tell her to come back on Monday. This lady's got some kind of fake papers, Vance said, waving the orders around. Says she's a general or something. Can you believe that? Miller, a smug grin on his face, took the papers. He scanned them, his eyes wide. He saw the same information and, like Vance, his brain failed to process the reality of the situation. He saw a civilian, not an officer. He saw a threat, not an authority figure. This is hilarious, Miller said, handing the papers back to Vance. A general, in a rental car. And she's not even in uniform. Ma'am, you've got some nerve. I'm gonna have to call the MPs. That would be a good idea, Reed said calmly. You've already committed several security violations, and I am sure the MPs will be keen to hear about them. The threat of the MPs, instead of intimidating her, seemed to bolster the guards' resolve. They saw her composure as defiance, her calm as a challenge. Listen, lady, Vance said, stepping forward and placing a hand on her car's hood. You're not getting in. We're going to run a background check on you. And when this all comes back a big fat nothing, you're gonna be in a world of trouble. Reed didn't move. She watched him, her eyes sharp and focused. You've failed to properly verify my identity. You've failed to follow standard operating procedure for a vehicle stop. You've introduced a physical barrier to my movement. And you've done all of this with a flagrant disregard for the authority of the Army. I am the authority here, Vance shouted, his face reddening. I'm the one with the weapon and the badge. You're just a nobody. You're a corporal, Reed said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. And you've just made a very serious mistake. Just then, a battered pickup truck pulled up behind Reed's car, the driver honking impatiently. This added to the chaos and heightened the guards' agitation. They were losing control of the situation, and they knew it. Vance, seeing the growing line of cars, panicked. He slammed his hand on the hood of Reed's car again, a loud thud that echoed in the quiet afternoon. "Get out of the car, ma'am. Now, we're detaining you." Reed remained still, her hand still on the steering wheel. This was the moment she had been waiting for. She had seen their operational deficiencies, their lack of discipline, their arrogant disregard for protocol. Now, she was seeing their complete failure under pressure. "This is General Reed." A voice boomed from a loudspeaker on one of the guard shacks. It was the gate sergeant, a grizzled old staff sergeant, who had been watching the whole spectacle unfold from his office. He had been on the phone with the duty officer, trying to figure out what was going on. A quick search of the official roster had revealed the new commander's name. A quick cross-reference of the name and the rank, a rank he had never seen at Fort Bracken, sent a cold wave of dread through him. Vance and Miller froze, their bravado evaporating in an instant. They looked at each other, then at the guard shack, then back at the woman in the car. The name clicked. The rank clicked. The reality of the situation came crashing down on them with the force of 1,000-pound weight. The duty officer, a harried captain, ran out of the guard shack, his uniform a mess and his hair disheveled. "General Reed, my deepest apologies. There's been a terrible misunderstanding." Staff Sergeant, a man named Sergeant First Class Davies, the irony of his last name not lost on the general, now stood ramrod straight outside the shack. "Sir, ma'am. General, I apologize for the conduct of my men. They didn't." He trailed off, his face a mask of shame and fear. General Reed finally stepped out of the car. She was not a tall woman, but she carried herself with an authority that made her seem to tower over everyone present. She walked over to the two young guards, her boots silent on the asphalt. "Private Miller, Corporal Vance, stand to attention." The two men snapped into position, their chins tucked, their shoulders squared. They were trembling. General Reed didn't yell. She didn't scream. She simply spoke, her voice low and clear, cutting through the silence of the gate. "In the last 7 minutes, I have observed a total of 5 major security violations. You failed to properly identify me. You failed to follow procedure for a civilian stop. You failed to maintain situational awareness. 2. You failed to treat a civilian with courtesy, and you attempted to physically detain a superior officer. Every one of those is a serious offense." Her eyes, cold and hard, fixed on them. "Your lack of discipline, your arrogance, and your complete disregard for the mission are a direct reflection of the leadership of this post, and I am here to fix it." The duty officer, Captain Reynolds, tried to interject. "General, if I could just explain." "You will not," Reed said, her eyes never leaving the two guards. "You were in charge of this gate. You are responsible for their actions. You are relieved of your duties, effective immediately. Sergeant Davies, you are in charge until a new officer is assigned. You will have these 2 privates report to the Post Education Center at 0800 hours on Monday for a full review of basic military protocols." Then, they will be given a remedial training course on security procedures. If they fail, they will be reassigned. Understood. Sergeant Davies swallowed hard. Understood, ma'am. Now, where is Colonel Davies? She asked, her voice turning even colder. Captain Reynolds, his face ashen, pointed to the post commander's office. He's expecting you, General. I'm sure he is, Reed said, a grim line forming on her lips. She looked back at the two guards, their faces pale with shock and terror. This is not a game. This is not a playground. This is a military installation, and you are its first line of defense. Remember that, because I will, quote. With that, she turned and walked through the gate, her footsteps echoing in the sudden, complete silence. The truck driver behind her, who had watched the entire scene unfold with a look of stunned disbelief, let out a low whistle and drove off, leaving the three soldiers standing at attention. Their world having just been turned upside down. Base, it turned out, was even worse than the reports had suggested. General Reed spent the rest of the day in her new office, a stark room with a large window overlooking the parade grounds. She had a file on every officer, every department head, every major contractor. The rot was deep, and it was widespread, quote. She had already called in the provost marshal, a stern-faced major, who was a refreshing island of competence in a sea of mediocrity, and had him begin an immediate, top-to-bottom audit of the base's security protocols. The next morning, the post was buzzing. The news of the incident at the gate had spread like wildfire. The story was retold and embellished a dozen times, but the core details remained the same. The new general, a woman, had been mistaken for a civilian and had dismantled the guard contingent at the front gate. The guards, who had been the embodiment of the post's lax attitude, were now a cautionary tale. The atmosphere on the base changed almost instantly. Soldiers who had been ambling around with their hands in their pockets suddenly stood at attention when an officer passed. The mess hall, usually a loud and boisterous place, was eerily quiet. Everyone was on edge, wondering when and where the general would strike next. General Reed, for her part, was working tirelessly. She was a woman of habit, and her habits were all about work. She woke before dawn, went for a run, and was in her office by 0600. Her first official meeting was with Colonel Davies, the man she was replacing. He arrived flustered, his uniform rumpled, and his golf clubs still in the trunk of his car. The meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. Reed was not one for small talk. She informed him that he was being relieved of his command and would be placed on administrative leave pending an investigation. He tried to argue, but she simply handed him a stack of papers detailing his many failures. He left the office, a broken man, his career effectively over. The rest of the week was a blur of meetings, audits, and dismissals. The base's chief of staff, a man who had been a loyal sycophant to Colonel Davies, was sent packing. The head of logistics, who had been siphoning off supplies for his own personal gain, was arrested. The provost marshal, a major named Thorne, was a good man, and he was quickly promoted to colonel. But the biggest change was in the culture of the base. General Reed didn't just want to fire people. She wanted to instill a new sense of professionalism and pride. She held a post-wide assembly, where she spoke in a measured, calm voice about the importance of duty, honor, and country. She didn't mince words. She spoke of the sacrifices of the soldiers who had come before them, and the importance of upholding the traditions of the army. She spoke of the need for discipline, not just in the ranks, but in the heart. The soldiers listened intently. They had never heard an officer speak like this before. She wasn't giving a pep talk. She was giving a mission statement. She was telling them that the days of complacency were over, that the future of Fort Bracken and their careers depended on them. The two guards from the gate, Private Miller and Corporal Vance, were a case study in her methods. They were a vivid example of everything that was wrong with the base, and she made sure they were seen as such. They spent the next 2 weeks in a grueling remedial training program, where they were taught everything from proper gate security protocols to the basic tenets of military leadership. They were broken down and rebuilt, and by the end of it, they were no longer the arrogant young men they had been. They were soldiers, and they had a newfound respect for their duty. In a strange way, General Reed's arrival at Fort Bracken had been a blessing. She was a storm, a force of nature that had swept through the post, clearing out the cobwebs and the rot. She was a general who believed in leading from the front, a woman who wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty. Her final act in her first week was to hold a ceremony at the main gate. She stood at attention, alongside the newly promoted Colonel Thorne, and watched as Private Miller and Corporal Vance, now in clean, starched uniforms, stood guard. They were no longer the two young men who had scoffed at a civilian in a rented car. They were soldiers, and they were ready. As a new vehicle approached the gate, a brand new sedan, driven by a crisp, serious-looking major, the two soldiers snapped to attention, their movements sharp and precise. They saluted, their hands touching their brows with a professionalism that had been absent just a week ago. Reed watched, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching her lips. She had a long way to go, but she had started. The gates of Fort Bracken were now secure, and the rest of the post would soon follow. She was a general who had no clue who she was, and now, no one would ever forget. She had arrived, and Fort Bracken would never be the same.